Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to the Central Bank of Malta's webinar. This is being organised by the Economics Department, and very many thanks to Brian Micallef and Aaron Gregg, who are here with us today. We're thrilled to be able to invite you to this event. The title of the event is Age, Morbidity, or Something Else. The cost of providing healthcare has been growing rapidly in high-income countries and is doing so faster than can be explained by demographic growth and an aging population. But how much of the increasing costs are due to individuals living longer, thanks to new technology and medical practice, and how much is actually due to the innovation which is driving up the cost of providing health services? In other words, is the cost of providing healthcare going up because people are older and sicker, because new, more expensive technologies are available to older and sicker people over time, or perhaps both? And here to tell us a little bit more about that, we are delighted to have with us Professor Mauro Laudicella. Professor Laudicella is a professor in health economics at the Danish Center for Health Economics, part of the University of Southern Denmark. And he's also an honorary research fellow at the Business School of the Imperial College in London. His recent research focuses on the impact of technological progress and change in medical practice on the demand of healthcare and the economic returns of public spending for new technologies and innovation, which of course we'll be hearing a lot more about in his lecture. His research outcomes have been published in very high-ranked international journals in the field of health economics, so we really are honoured to have him here with us. Before we actually start, could I perhaps go through a few of the housekeeping rules? A few years ago, of course, we had never heard of anything like this, but now that everything has moved online, please bear with me while I just go through a few reminders. We would appreciate it if everybody except the current speaker remains on mute. And it's also much easier to follow the person who is speaking if you keep your videos off, please. Of course, we will have question and answers at the end. And then, of course, it's perfectly appropriate for you to turn on your videos when you are making an intervention. We'll go through the housekeeping rules and the rules for questions and answers. Later, we will be taking questions both through the raise hand feature, which you can find on the top ribbon of the Teams page, but you can also send them to us in the chat, which forms part of this. We remind you that the event is being recorded and that the recording will be available on our YouTube channel, on our website, and we will be notifying people once it is available. But before I introduce Professor Laudicella, before we move on to the actual lecture, I'd like to ask Aaron Gregg, our chief economist here at the Central Bank of Malta, to explain a little bit more about the subject and why we're talking about this. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you everyone for attending this seminar. Of course, health expenditure is not usually associated as an area that is of interest to central banks. However, even in the area of central banking, things are changing very rapidly, and the areas of interest of macroeconomic analysis have changed really a lot since COVID. The pandemic has made economic policy and medical policy go hand in hand, and us economists, we've had to look into topics that previously were typically held just to be in the remit of health economics. Even to do our projections these days, we have to follow very closely what is happening to the pandemic. Once the medical emergency is over, there will still be the big issue of what's happening to health expenditure. Health expenditure is an area that had already been rising very dramatically in a lot of Western European nations, due primarily to aging. However, with the pandemic, of course, health expenditure has increased very dramatically in all countries across the world, and there is a big question mark whether this increase is temporary due to the pandemic, or whether even after the pandemic slows down, whether this will be inbuilt into the system things like whether there will be an increase in the need for preventive medicine, increase in health and sanitation costs, whether these will be embedded more long-term in normal health expenditure. Now, the area of analysis that Mauro specializes in will help in understanding this. Mauro, in the presentation, will be looking at how to try to decompose the secular increase in health expenditure into that part which is explainable by, let's call them demographic factors, by medical factors, and that part which is driven by technology, by changes in practices that are in a sort of way a feedback from the fact that science and medicine is being successful, that it's lengthening lives, and whether the lengthening of lives is going to result in itself into an increase of expenditure. This is a question that one can eventually apply to what will happen after the pandemic. There is a lot of literature now coming out about long-term COVID, so how people who have recovered from COVID will still have a change in their health, even though they are now cured from COVID, and whether, therefore, this will require further increases in expenditure going forward. So I think the subject, although it is not directly related to the pandemic, the subject we're going to discuss, its methods will become very useful when later on we will be looking at the longer term impact on health expenditure on macroeconomies across the Western European Union and beyond. And now I ask Mauro to start with his presentation, and I invite you to put the questions as much as possible till the end. If you have a question that you want to put while he is presenting, please put it in the chat so that then we can pick everything up at the end.
Okay, Mauro, perhaps you'd like to upload your presentation?
Yes. Okay.
That's fine. We're seeing it fine. Over to you, Mauro. Please just let me know if you have any problems. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay, great. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking at this venue, and thanks for the introduction. So I will straight in with the presentation. This is a joint work with other colleagues of mine, Paolo Lidoni from University of Palermo, Kim Rose Olsen, and Dorte Geert Hansen from SDU. Okay, so objectives of this presentation, of this work, this piece of research. First of all, we want to measure the increment of healthcare expenditure that is driven by technological progress, and we'll define what I mean by technological progress. The second objective is to decompose such an increment into the part that is due to the effect of delay in time to that, and the part that is due to the effect of intensity of resource use. So delay in time to that is an effect that one would expect from technological progress, as one of the objectives of technological progress in medicine and in healthcare is to save patient lives. And by saving patient lives, so by increasing life expectancies of individuals after an health shock, then they allow for individuals to contribute to the demand for longer. And this may have consequences on the total costs. And the second part, the intensity of resource use effect, is something that you would expect as the basket of services that are needed to take care of individuals with a specific health shock is increasing over time in costs due to the fact that due to the cost of technological innovation. So to allow for technological innovation, that basket of service increases in cost over time. It also increases in quality. Okay. First of all, a little on the definition of technological progress that I'm using here. So technological progress here, I'm trying to use it in a very broad way. And with this term, I will cover and include tangible new technologies, such as, for example, physical equipment, hospital physical equipment, or new drugs or new treatments. But also, it will include intangible know-how. And in healthcare, such an intangible know-how is defined most often as medical practice. This is basically the organization of services and equipment in a way such that you achieve the objective, that is basically to deliver high quality healthcare. And so as time goes by and more knowledge is acquired, then medical practice change, most often like evidence-based medical practice. And so this will also be included in this definition of technological progress used here. Okay, great. Oops. Okay, it's moving. So some of the motivations. So first of all, healthcare expenditure is growing fast in many high-income countries. And here I'm reporting graphs for at least 3 countries, Germany, Denmark, and United States. You can see that the healthcare expenditure, this is total per capita healthcare expenditures and is not adjusted for inflation. And in just the span of 16 years, we're moving fast. We more than double in the United States. And this growth outpaces demographic growth and the aging of the population. So there is some puzzle there on the understanding why healthcare expenditure is growing so fast. So the hypotheses investigated here, first of all, some of the hypotheses investigated in the literature, most of the macroeconomics literature in health economics, looking at the cost of care, it's focuses on 3 main factors: the aging of the populations, the morbidity of the populations, and also the proximity to death. Evidence on existing models are showing us that, yes, the aging population, of course, concur in increasing the demand of healthcare and so costs. But it's not the only factor, and it doesn't allow us to explain all the growth that we see in the time series. And one of also evidence on the aging populations are also at odds with evidence of healthy aging. So there's a strand of the literature that's showing us that we are living longer, but we are living longer and not spending more years of our lives with morbidities. So as individuals become older and live longer, they are basically shifting forward a constant number of years lived with disabilities. So an aging population alone doesn't seem to provide us like a full explanation of the growth in healthcare expenditure. So the hypothesis investigated here is that healthcare expenditure growth is driven by an interaction between age, morbidity, and technological progress. So that healthcare expenditure is not growing because individuals are older or sicker over time, but because we have new and more expensive technologies that are available to treat older and sicker people over time. Okay, so the interaction between these 2 factors. Also, some of the challenges. The first challenge is the lack of an agreement on a specific definition of technological progress. Technological progress may mean different things in different healthcare sectors. For example, in the primary care sector or in secondary care sector, it means different things. In the pharmaceutical sector, it means other things. And so to have a definition that is very comprehensive and capture all these different aspects in the various sectors of healthcare is challenging. And what is challenging is a specific definition, a definition that can be actioned with indicators of technological progress. So after we agree on a definition of technological progress, we're left with the problem of how do we measure it? Where are the indicators of such definitions? And are these indicators consistent over time? So existing indicators of technological progress used in the literature, especially in the macroeconomics literature, are often, like, for example, number of patents, number of new patents generated in the healthcare sector, or expenditure in R&D, research and development. Well, but these indicators, they bring some problems. First of all, they tend to cover one sector more than others. For example, number of patents usually covers a lot, like the sectors of the pharmaceutical sector, as well as expenditure in R&D. But if we track technological progress by using a number of patents, then we have a problem, because over time, the quality of patents is not constant. And so there are patents that are more meaningful than others. And they bring different type of innovations, and they make different contributions to innovation. And the problem with expenditure in R&D is that this expenditure has not constant productivity over time. So expenditure in the past has been more productive in generating innovation and technological progress than expenditure in present years. So again, these are all indicators that bring some limitations. So the existing studies are led by macroeconomic studies, and such macroeconomic studies, they tend to use a residual approach in facing these challenges, by which I mean that they use a steady state growth model, and they include in the model all the observable elements, such as, for example, population growth, population aging sometimes, income elasticities. And then they left a residual out, and the residual is interpreted as the growth that is explained by technological progress in the macroeconomic model. They bring some limitations. For example, the impact of technological progress on healthcare expenditure depend on assumptions on income elasticity in the model. And also these models do not provide control for morbidity. Okay. So, after giving some context, let's dig into the methods that I'm proposing here. So essentially, I'm combining a residual approach that is proposed by macroeconomics model with microdata. Okay, we now have very high quality microdata on individual using care that can be used to predict what is the contribution of healthcare expenditure of different factors. And in this combination, there's a very specific identification approach that I'm using. So I'm looking at repeated cross-sections of individuals, over time that experience an initial health shock, let's say over a 10 years time window. So I'm following individuals as they having an initial health shock, for example, a stroke. So we can follow individuals having a stroke, say, in 2005, and then others individuals having a similar stroke in 2006, 7, 8, and so on, until, for example, for this specific study, 2013, 14. And then we can capture an observable technological progress to which they are exposed as they experience their shock at different point in time, after controlling for observable confounding factors, such as their morbidity and their socioeconomic status over time. So essentially, the idea here is that an individual suffering a stroke in, say, 10 years ago from now, that individual would be taken care of by the available technologies of 10 years ago. And a similar individual experiencing a similar shock, a stroke today, instead would be exposed and will be treated by using the best technology that is available today. Okay, so after we can control for confounding differences, such as, for example, difference in morbidity between individuals suffering from this health shock in these two different points in time and their socioeconomic status and other confounders, then what we are left with is this unobservable technological progress to which they are exposed. This could be like new tangible technologies, and also the new know-how, the new medical practice to which they are exposed. Okay, so the identification is driven by some degree of random assignment of individuals to their health shocks. So the individuals don't decide when to have a stroke over time. And also we can control for a rich set of indicators to adjust for potential bias in this assignment. Okay. So something about the study population. So how do we go about to use this approach? So we studied the individuals in Denmark, residents in Denmark, age 15 and over, and we looked for individuals who have an initial shock. And this initial shock we searched for between 2005 and 2014. So individuals having an initial shock in this time frame. And that would give us a population, a total population of 1 million individuals. And these individuals that we follow for this within this time frame, they absorb about 23% of the national healthcare expenditure for secondary care. Okay, so this is an interesting population to look at. An health shock is defined as an emergency admission to hospital with at least 1 day of length of stay. So this is a very generic way of capturing a large and heterogeneous group of individuals, but we can control for such heterogeneity, and also we can zoom into some specific health shock in the analysis. So we can zoom into individuals, for example, having a specific health shock for a stroke or cancer or heart attack. Okay, so then we also, so initial shock, we mean that this is an health shock that is the first health shock in 5 years, in a 5 years time window. So basically individuals having like a shock in the past are excluded from this analysis because they may be exposed to technologies in the past, and this technology may affect their characteristics, and they can be confounding the results of our analysis. Okay. And from this population, we extract data on utilization of inpatient and outpatient care. So we are focusing really on hospital care. And we also extract information on primary diagnosis, comorbidity, socioeconomic status, income. Okay. Okay. So what type of research question can we answer with the data, with these data? Okay, so the first research question we can answer is what is the increment in the healthcare expenditure per individual? So for each individual exposed to an health shock between this 8-year time window. Okay, what is the increment, the total increment? How much more it's costing us to treat individual with an health shock after an 8-year time window? And second, we can say, what is the increment that is explained by the difference in age or the difference in morbidity? And then we can answer the question about what is the increment that is attributable to technological progress. I think okay, so this is some of the descriptive statistics on the population at the two edge of the time distribution. Okay, so at the beginning of the time series, 2005, and the end of the time series, 2013. So, okay, what difference in the characteristics we observe? Well, we have some differences that are due to age, and they're reported in the last column. And yeah, here we go. So we can say that in the latest interval, so in 2013, people are a little older. People having a health shock are about half a year older. They have a little more comorbidities, and they have a higher risk of death than people in 2005. Okay, so that's the difference highlighted here. Also, they have some differences in the type of morbidities that they have. For example, there's a reduction in cardiovascular diseases, as highlighted here. And there is an increment in cancer and metastatic cancer. Okay. Right. So how does it look in the descriptive, in the descriptive statistics, how does it look the difference in cost per individuals, per person? And this is how it looks. This graph is reporting the average healthcare expenditure per individuals for individuals having an health shock in 2005-6, red line, and individuals having an health shock in 2013-14. And what is plotted here is the difference in average cost at different point in times elapsed after the health shock. So we have 2 years before the health shock. So these patients were generating costs before the health shock. 1 year before the health shock, these costs are moderate, but they are there. You can think about some of these individuals, for example, are because they are old individuals, they may be under like an elective treatment course, and that's what generating this cost. Then they experience the health shock as we define it, and we have this spike in cost, and that is exactly here. And that spike is basically showing us the average healthcare expenditure within 1 year from the health shocks, including the health shock costs. And that is the difference that is due to the fact that some people having the health shock in 2005-06 and some others in 13-14. Of course, this difference may be explained by difference in their age, different in morbidity, different in the type of shock they're experiencing. And this is what we're going to disentangle with the econometric analysis. So something about the model. Well, the model is just a simple, for this piece of work, for this first piece of analysis, the model is just a GLM, a generalized linear model. And it's just a model that fit the distribution. There is a skew distributions of cost data. You can also examine this data also using an OLS, if you like. What is the power of this analysis? The angle and the cut of the data. So how are we looking to individuals? This idea of looking at them at the time of the initial shock and following them up afterwards. And then also what is powerful here is the richness of the data that we're using that allow us to control for morbidities in a very accurate way. Okay, so some results. So here we have 3 models plotting results from 3 different specifications of the GLM regression. The first specification is plotting just the trend. So it's plotting basically the time when individuals experience the health shock. And this time trend is basically quantifying the amount of healthcare expenditure per individual that is that has grown during the 8 years time window that we're looking at. And so we have a 16.9 percentage points growth in healthcare expenditure in this time interval. And this can be due to different things like age, morbidity. And so we add to the model age in order to understand how much of the growth can be explained by variation in age. And what we find is that just a very small amount of this 16% growth can be attributed to age. So 7% of the total growth can be attributed to the difference in age of the individuals having this health shock that we're examining here. Then we add to the model morbidity, and what we find is that this amount from 7% is rising up to 40%. So 40% of this total growth can be explained by age and morbidities, the fact that individuals are having more severe health shocks over time. The rest, it's quite a relevant amount that is left unexplained, and we attribute this amount after also controlling for socioeconomic conditions. We are left with a 60% of this 16% increment in costs that is unexplained by age and morbidity, and that we can attribute to technological progress. Okay, so about 60%. This is in the ballpark of macroeconomic studies taking like a different angle at a similar research question. Okay. Then I can move to the second methods, the second basket of methods that we're using to answer the second objective of the study, which is to decompose such an impact of technological progress. So this amount of the growth that we attribute to technological progress, we want to decompose it into the amount that can be explained by a survival effect, individuals living longer and so being able to contribute to the demand of care for longer, and an intensity effect. Individuals basically, the basket of service consumed by the individuals becoming more expensive over time. Okay. So for this second type of analysis, we need to take a slightly different angle. We need to follow up individuals over time after the health shock. So now we have to start following individuals up to 3 years after their initial health shock. Individuals having the health shock in 2005 are the baseline, and then we compare them with individuals having a health shock in 2013, okay? And we look at the difference over time and how this difference in cost over time changes as the time elapsed from their initial health shocks. Okay, and so we have 2 dimensions of times. One is the calendar year when they experience the health shock, which allow us to capture the unobservable effect of technological progress. And the second is elapsed time after the health shock that allow us to examine the accumulation of cost over time and make the decomposition. Okay. Well, okay, some details on the econometric models that we're using here. I will go a little fast. It's not really important for the message of this presentation, but is worth mentioning what type of methods are we using to analyze the data. And for this second part of the analysis, we're using a cost accumulation function that has been proposed and introduced first by Basel and Manning in 2010. There's a journal, there's an article published in the journal in Health Economics, and it's referenced at the end of the presentation. And so they propose basically a cost function that is defined by this equation here. And the intuition behind this cost function is this. So if we want to know the total cost of generated by an individual from period 1 up to period K after the health shock, so if we want to know what's the total cost after K periods, then that cost will be driven by, first of all, the probability that the individual is alive after such K periods, and that is the first element of the equation, and then multiplied by what is the cost that is going to be generated by the individuals at the K period. And such a cost in the K period will be a different cost whether the individual survived during the period, that is expressed by this part of the equation. So if the individual survive, then it will generate this cost mu 2j. And if instead the individual doesn't survive, then it will generate a different cost, and is this mu 1j. And the reason is that individuals entering time to death, they generally generate very expensive costs, and they are better to be modeled with the 2 separate functions. Okay. Okay, great. And then this equation allows us to estimate the cost accumulation equation can be estimated by a 3-part model. We have the first part that predicts the probability of surviving up to the period J, say. And then we have a second part of the model that model costs for individuals who are going to experience time to death, so individuals who die in a given period. And then another part for individuals that instead survive that specific period. So that's just to give you an overview of the model. Okay, that would be the estimated cost, the estimated function. I don't want to spend much time here. If there are questions, I can go back to this equation. And then this equation is differentiated against the effect of technological progress. And that allows us to decompose the marginal effect of variation due to technological progress into a part that is due to delay in time to death and a part that is due to increasing intensity of resource use. Again, these are only details, and I can go back to these details if there are questions. Right. I think what is important to take from the details that I show is that the decomposition of the cost function into the part of the cost that can be attributed to like survival and the part that are due to intensity of resource use, such a decomposition is achievable thanks to the cost function that we're using. So there is not a direct observations of individuals who are just generating survival costs and individuals that are producing just intensity or resource use costs. These two things are very intertwined. And so in order to be separated is like an exercise that can be done by using like a specific cost function, such the one that I'm proposing here. So results. Here we go. So the first things that I want to show you are differences in survivals. Okay, so the first part of the three-part model. What kind of difference in survivals can we observe if we compare individuals that have an health shock in 2005 with individuals experiencing a similar shock in 2013, after controlling for any kind of differences in their morbidity, socioeconomic status, and age? So then you will see that there are 4 panels here. The first panel is showing you results in difference in survival for the overall population, okay? So we're looking at everyone having a health shock. We're plotting everyone together, we're controlling from the different health shocks in the regression model, and then if we ask the question, have we achieved better survivals over time? Yes, we did, and the better survivals in overall are quantifiable as this difference that I am highlighting here. With the continuous line, you see, is the survival function for somebody who have an health shock, who has an health shock in 2005, and this continuous curve, instead the dash curve, is the survival for somebody having an health shock in 2013. So after 360 days from the shock, that's the bar, the red bar here, after 360 days from the shock, we can report this difference in survival. It's about 2.5 percentage points. Now, 2.5 percentage point may seem little, but it's actually a very huge difference if you consider how large is this population. It's 1 million individuals included here. And it's quite a remarkable achievement, I think, to have reached such a improvement in survival. And the improvement in survival, of course, increased if we look at the survivals after 2 years, 720 days, the second red bar, or after 3 years, yeah, and 1,080 days. But the largest increment appears to be after 1 year. Okay, so, and this is the increment that can be attributed to the fact that individuals having the health shock in 2013, they are treated with better technologies. This can be like physical technologies or just know-how. The doctor knows better how to treat these patients, and they can achieve, therefore, better health outcomes. Okay. And then the other panels, cancer, AMI, and stroke, they're zooming in the total population, they're zooming in and looking at individuals with health shocks that are associated with specific conditions. In the first panel here, so the second panel on the right top, we have individuals having an health shock for cancer. And you can see that the scale is quite different, and there's quite a remarkable improvement in survival for individuals having a shock for cancer. Now, this is not the survival of individuals after a cancer diagnosis. This is the survival of individuals who had a cancer diagnosis, and then they had a deterioration of their health that led to an emergency admission. Okay, so for those individuals who have experienced an emergency admission due to cancer, then the survival probabilities have improved quite a lot. Okay, and that it's almost 10%, which is quite a remarkable increment. And then we have the third panel on the bottom left, that is showing you the same picture of survival for individuals with an heart attack, AMI, and then individuals with a stroke. Also here, remarkable improvements in survivals. Great. Okay, so how this is translating to cost? Okay, then we need to move to the last figure of the presentation. If I can. Okay, here we go. So figure 3 here is showing us the outcomes of the cost function that I showed you before. So let me describe these curves to you one by one. So let's start with the continuous line, and let's start with the panel on the top left. These are the same panels we show for survival, but here now I'm plotting costs. And in the y-axis here, I'm plotting basically thousands of euros, okay? So these are like thousands of euros. So 0.5 is about 500 euros. And this is a different per capita, per individuals with anal shock. And what is the continuous line showing you? It's the cumulative cost after the health shock, but the cumulative difference in cost. So it's the cumulative difference in cost of an individual having a shock in 2013 against the baseline, so against an individual having an health shock in 2005. So this is the difference in cost of these individuals, and that difference in cost is cumulated, is piled up, summed up over time by the days after the health shock. So after we reach this red line, we have basically the total cost, the total cumulated cost difference after a year from the health shock. And then we have the total cumulated cost difference after 2 years from the health shock and 3 years after the health shock. So you can see that this curve is positive. So it's showing you like increments in the difference in cost, which means that basically is more expensive to treat an individual having a health shock in 2013 than an individual in 2005. Okay, and how much more expensive? Well, it's exactly what is plotted by this curve. So that's the total difference in cost. This curve is basically decomposing what was the total difference that I show you in the first batch of results, of the regression results. Those results were showing you the average difference after a year, for a year. And here instead, you have the cumulative difference over time. Okay. Now, the dashed line that lies just below the continuous line, the long dash curve here, that is this is the part of the continuous curve that can be decomposed and attributed to intensity of resource use. So this dashed line is showing you how much of the difference in cost that is reported by the continuous line can be attributed to the fact that the basket of service accessed by individuals with an health shock in this 2 different period of time is more expensive. So this basket of services is more expensive. They're using resources that are more expensive, and that is how much this higher cost of the resources contribute to the total costs, quite a lot. And then this short dash curve on the bottom is showing you the amount of cost that instead is due to the survival effect. So the amount of the total cost that can be explained by the fact that the individuals in these 2 different periods of time are experiencing different survival, and so they're able to contribute to the demand of care for longer. And although it's smaller than the resource-intensive use, which is what we would expect, it's still substantial, and it can reach quite a substantial amount for the total population. Of course, the dynamic described in this graph, is a bit different if we go for if we zoom in into specific shocks, for example, cancer, heart attacks, and stroke. In cancer, so individuals having a shock for cancer, the difference in cost, it's much higher than for the total population. This is individuals cost per individuals, and a lot of the costs are explained by the survival. So a lot of the difference in costs that we are reporting for these individuals can be explained by the fact that individuals with a health shock due to cancer are able to survive longer. And because such individuals usually, this is a chronic condition, and you don't ever recover fully from it, but you are in a course of treatment for life most of the time, then the fact that you survive actually generates quite a lot of costs. For AMI, so individuals with an heart attack, it's a very interesting feature because the curves, the total cost curves, the continuous curves, is negative, which means that over time, for a patient having a heart attack, the total cost of treating these patients that is due to technological progress is actually smaller. So it's reducing over time. So technology is not always meaning higher costs. Sometimes it can result into lower costs. And this is something that can happen, for example, if a better technology reduce the use of unnecessary care. In the case of a patient with an heart attack, there's been quite an improvement in reducing emergency readmissions of individuals after the first heart attack. Okay, so then such an improvement results into lower total cost. So what we see here with this continuous line is basically the net effect of technological progress, which include some cost reducing that can be, for example, due to the fact that the individual use less intensive care, less acute care, and the costs that are due to the fact that individuals are living longer, and that the basket of service also is a little bit more expensive to allow for the cost of innovation. In the case of heart attack, the net effect of technological progress seems to be like a cost saving. Of course, this cost saving is mainly driven by the fact that they're using less expensive service, reduction in emergency secondary care admissions, while instead the survival effect cost is always positive. Basically, as you survive longer, you can contribute to non-negative amount of cost. Okay, and that's basically by definition, really. Okay, so finally, the case of stroke. In the case of stroke, it seems that the increment in cost is quite substantial. The scale is different, and there's been a lot of investment into the treatment of patients with stroke. Most of this investment is basically resulting in a basket of services is more expensive. In fact, you can see that the intensity of resource use curve is basically almost reproducing exactly the total cost curves. So it means that it's driven by that, while instead the survival costs are moderate or negligible. Okay, and this is all with results. Okay, quick recap. So with these studies, we measured the overall effect of technological progress on healthcare expenditure using a residual approach. Okay, so we don't have a direct indicator of technological progress. We use a little trick. We have very good indicators of observable differences in age and morbidity and socioeconomic characteristics. And so we use this indicator to capture technological progress as a residual of the regression. But this approach means that it's very easy to export to different countries, because you don't have to construct a technological progress indicator. Such indicator doesn't have to be homogeneous if you compare different countries. The second part of the presentation, we decompose this, the amount of growth of healthcare expenditure can be attributed to technological progress. We decompose it into the part that is due to intensity of resource use and the part that is due to better survival, delaying time to death. That's how we call it in the working paper. And into this decomposition, we are supported by the particular cost function that we are using. This is not exotic cost function. It's been used in many other works, and here are reporting some. And this cost function has this nice feature that allows us to decompose, to take a look at these different components, the survival component and the intensity of resource use component. Okay. Something about discussion now. Well, the estimates of the impact of technological progress on healthcare expenditure that we get by using our approach, this approach, they are in the ballpark of other studies, macroeconomic studies, using a similar approach, but also direct approach into investigating the impact of technological progress on healthcare expenditure. And such studies typically report the impact of technology is reported as being between 40 and 70% of the growth. But using microdata give us an edge, so we can do things that macroeconomic studies cannot do. For example, we can introduce a very accurate control for morbidity, and so we can be sure that the growth is not driven by a measured morbidity in the population. We don't have to make an assumption on income elasticities in our model. Such elasticity may affect, actually does affect the predictions of macroeconomic models. And we also are able to decompose the total impact into survival and intensity of resource use effect. And here, I think I finish with my presentation. Thanks for your attention, and now I'm happy to take questions. Okay.
Thank you, Mauro. I don't know if you wish to leave the questions up in case. We've got a couple of flags raised. Brian Mikalev, perhaps you'd like to start, and then afterwards Neville Kalea from the Health Policy. We will take your question. Brian, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for this very interesting presentation, Mauro. It was super interesting, very clear, and even a non-expert like me could easily follow. I mean, it's amazing that you have this micro database which allows you to do other things that working with aggregate data definitely would not allow you. I have 3 questions. The first one relates to your econometric model. So you say that you're controlling for age, but if I read the table well, you're also controlling for gender. So it's not only age, but age and gender. And the coefficient for gender is, as expected, statistically significant even at the 0.1% level. And from the table, if I recall correctly, the first descriptive statistics, there are noticeable differences in gender over this period. So how much do you think your results are influenced by the fact that you're controlling not only for age, but also for gender? My second comment, I'm a macroeconomist, so when you were thinking about the residual approach, I couldn't help but notice the striking differences with the so-called solo residual that we use to measure total factor productivity as an input to measure potential output. And we refer to this residual, I mean, sometimes we call it technology, sometimes we call it total factor productivity or productive efficiency. But at the end of the day, it is a measure kind of our ignorance. That part that we cannot actually measure. So it's a catchphrase for all the factors that at the end of the day we cannot measure. So how exposed do you think you are for this criticism? And finally, if I may ask, when you plotted the survival probabilities, I agree with you that there are visual differences between the 2005 and 2006 period and the last period, the 2013, 2014. But are these differences statistically different from each other? Perhaps in the graph you could also plot kind of the confidence intervals. That's all. But again, thanks a lot for this presentation. It was super interesting and very relevant topic at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I will start with the first one about gender. Okay, first of all, I think it's an interesting comment. I didn't actually focus on gender, but what I can do is to repeat the analysis excluding and including gender and see then how much is driven by gender. I don't think it will be much, even if the gender is an important factor because of the p-value. That doesn't. I need to quantify how much it contributes. I wouldn't be sure that it contributes for a lot. But if it does, what it's telling you in the regression is that individuals. So like the difference between male and female is becoming greater, and that a part of it could be due to survival effect, because in the first model we don't decompose the effect, and it could be that the survival of females is better than the survival of male after an health shock. I think I saw something in the medical literature showing, like, okay, commenting on differences in, you know, survival probabilities between male and women for specific conditions. But it's an interesting point, and I can only answer it by basically looking into it with, you know, with the model and the analysis. The second part, the residual effect and the measure of ignorance. I absolutely agree with you. This is a measure of ignorance. Now, this is a measure of ignorance in a very specific context, though. So what we are modeling here, it's healthcare expenditure. So it's not, so it's something that has some homogeneity on its own. And healthcare expenditure is driven by factors for which we know a lot about. And we know that an important component is age. We know that an important other component is morbidity. And we know that other components that drive this expenditure are technological progress, by which we mean not just new technologies, but also like a change in medical practice. Okay, so within the context of healthcare expenditure, then we have a high level of confidence that what we explain with the residual, it's the impact of technological progress. Then this level of confidence, of course, then we don't have the same level of confidence in saying, okay, in this technological progress, as we define it so broadly, how much is due to new patents, new drugs, new equipment, and how much instead is due, for example, in a change in medical practice, whereby a change in medical practice could be just a policy. So it could be just that the Ministry of Health introduces a new policy and says, okay, now this type of patient should be treated in outpatients rather than inpatient. So they define the policy, and then the health system, hospitals, has to arrange the services and reorganize the inputs in a way such that they respond to the policy and they change their practice. So at this stage of the research, we didn't dig in to understand exactly what various factors drives a residual in a more, you know, specific way. But in terms of what this residual could be, it's also backed by the existing literature on healthcare expenditure. We are very confident that they are they can be interpreted as technological progress. In terms of confidence intervals, all the difference in the curves that I have plotted in the final figure, I think they're all statistically significant, and I reminds you to the paper. I would redirect everyone who is interested to know exactly how large these confidence intervals are. I would remind to the working paper that is referenced at the end of the presentation. But I didn't plot the confidence interval in the graph because the graph is already very intense, and I wouldn't, you know, want to make it more intense. But thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you very much, Brian, and of course, thank you, Mauro. The next question is from Neville Kalea. Neville Kalea is the Director of Health Information and Research at the Ministry for Health, Mauro. So I'm sure his question will be extremely interesting. Neville, would you like to take the floor and turn on your camera?
Hi, I believe my camera is on now, so not sure if you're seeing.
Not yet, but don't worry, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, first of all, thanks. Very interesting presentation. I must admit, I had some interruptions along the way, so I apologize if you might have already addressed my questions. I was wondering that whether in your model you've included ancillary costs such as loss of productivity by carers of these patients, productivity of the same patients with the fact that they're living longer. And the reason I'm mentioning these ancillary costs is because I feel there should be like a bit of a health warning around this study, that it is not a cost-benefit analysis, even though there is a lot of components that would feed into a cost-benefit analysis. But if we have to look at the fuller picture, so to say, we have also to look at the economic contribution of the individuals living longer in the first place. Here in Malta, for example, we also have a substantial economic contribution of these typically retired individuals when it comes to even childcare. Many women are able, or I don't want to say women, but let's say parents, because it should be both parents, but unfortunately, it still affects mostly women in our society, are able to go back to their employment because their elderly parents, who might have had an MI, etc., have been saved and can contribute in terms of childcare as well. So I'm mentioning all this because we're talking about healthcare expenditure clearly. But if we want to extend this to a cost-benefit analysis, we might have to look at many more ancillary costs. So that's my question. And if I may add a comment to Mr. McAuliffe's question earlier, and I know you already answered to this, there are gender-specific differences that are not simply explained by the longer life expectancy in women. So, and that probably explains why you got an independent effect for gender rather than just something that once you adjust for age, it just disappears. We know from our experience and from our data that women tend to approach healthcare services more than men, for example, when it comes to preventive care. This could be primary prevention or secondary prevention. So it could be a lady who has had one of these problems we've discussed today. Women tend to be more attentive to the follow-up of their condition, and they might actually be in a better condition in the first place. So that probably might be behind the differences you came across for gender. Lastly, I honestly hope that we would be allowed access to these slides at a later stage, because I'd like to study them a bit more in detail, particularly the references that you've mentioned. Also to look at potentially reproducing this also with local data. Some people might think we don't have that much data locally, but we actually do have quite some data. And especially if there are academics in the audience, I would encourage them to please liaise, and we can discuss whether this study can be reproduced locally, because I'm sure it will give us some very interesting insights. So thank you. Sorry it took long, but I hope I made myself clear.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I will try to address them as best as I can. First of all, the cost-benefit analysis. So first of all, this is not, as you rightly comment, is not a cost-benefit analysis study. The perspective of this study is completely driven by cost and explaining cost. And in terms of cost, explaining healthcare expenditure per individuals using acute care, and explaining how much of this expenditure is not driven by factors that almost in many other studies are the usual suspects, like aging populations or increment in morbidity. So the first one of the contribution of these studies, one of the things where we wanted to hit was to say, okay, how much is left out after we explain age, gender, and morbidity? And it seems that there's quite a lot that is left out. In this, then we wanted to say, okay, what drives this amount of cost? We interpret it as technological progress. And in making such an interpretation, we follow other similar approaches in the macroeconomics literature. With respect to loss of productivity, I really follow the same. I mean, I agree with your comment. This is a very important component factors. And this enters the residual. So what we see is the net effect, including any gain or loss in productivity, which may happen, for example, for some conditions, you may have a gain in productivity over time. For some others, you can have a loss. And in fact, we observe different behaviors when we zoom in on patients with different conditions. Now, future studies. So this is the first seed. Then after this one, we are planning to make a deeper analysis where we want to disentangle the residual and understanding how much of the residual can be explained by a productivity gain or loss, and how much instead is like, reduction of unnecessary care, how much of the cost actually would be even higher if the new technology wouldn't, prevent patients to visit emergency rooms and seeking care, for example, a different level of care, for example, primary care. Also, this is a study only of secondary care. So we have outpatient and inpatient, but we don't look at hospital care. Some of the increment or reduction in cost may be due to a shift in the, a change in medical practice, so that patients with a condition in 2005 were treated in the hospital, and then new technologies, new practice comes by, and they are now treated by primary care or in less expensive settings. So that I hope address. So for that contribution, really, we need more time and further investigations in terms of productivity. And in terms also, like some of the difference in cost, as you rightly pointed out, can be due to difference in the family background of the patient. So some patients may have assistants like informal carer that can take care of them. And such informal care may be more or less prevalent over time. So there could be like that in future years, there will be more of this informal care, or there will be less. In this model, we have like a control for patients living alone. At least at that level, we are able to say if a patient is actually living alone or is living with a partner that could potentially take care of the patient after that shock. Okay, so I hope, and thanks for the contribution on gender. So yeah, I hope I address your questions.
Wonderfully, thank you so much.
Perhaps I could just ask the last question, Mauro. Looking towards the future and taking into account what Neville has just said, are there plans to repeat the study for those, for example, who haven't had an initial health shock? You mentioned at the beginning why this was important for your analysis. However, obviously in a country like, for example, in Malta, where we have so many people with chronic conditions like diabetes and so on, perhaps you could explain how future studies could perhaps look into that. And also, again, what Neville has just mentioned about the fact that this was not a cost-benefit analysis, still at the same time, you're looking at a cohort of patients that are 50 or over. And do you think your results would change, bearing in mind what Neville has said, with regards to the future and productivity, etc., if you took a younger cohort, where obviously then their survival will have a major impact on their contribution to the economy afterwards?
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Okay, so let's start with the future analysis and different angles. Yes, of course, you can look at different type of patients. Here we look at patients with an acute health shock, but we can also look at chronic patients. It's a little bit more difficult with chronic patients just because you want to have like so what is important is to have like a time point where you start your study. So what would be a time point for a chronic patient could be the clinical diagnosis of the chronic conditions, for example. And then we can start following the patients for a number of years and see what type of cost it generates. So yes, it can be done. We look at acute patients because they absorb quite an interesting amount of resources, and they were the best candidates for this first study, but then it can be expanded to look at different patients. In terms of younger, in terms of younger population, yes, also that could be included and studied. The reason why the younger populations are not often included unless they have unless they are individuals with specific conditions is because younger population normally do not generate significant healthcare costs, and so there's a lot of, in terms of the analysis, it would be a lot of zeros in the analysis, and they would be very difficult to model. So that's why most of these studies focus on older, older population. But that if a younger population with specific condition can be examined, for example, depression could be like a condition, So yeah, I hope I addressed your questions.
Fantastic. Mauro, as you said, this is the first study, and it's very, very interesting, as I'm sure you can tell from just the brief comments that we had. Neville, yes, the intention is for the whole recording to be put onto the Central Bank of Malta website, and Mauro has very kindly given us permission to also include his slides. If you go to the events tab on the website, everything will be listed there, but it is our intention to also issue a press release about the findings, to which all of these, the different collateral will also be appended. So you'll be able to get it both from the press release section or the news release section, and also from the event section. And hopefully we'll be able to drive people to this later on, also on our own social media. Brian and Aaron, we can't thank you enough for giving us exposure to Mauro. Mauro, we wish you and your team all the very best for your future research. Thank you, of course, to my communications team for helping to put us all of this together. And I wish you all a very, very good day. Thank you very much for being with us.